Welcome to Somnus Historia, where the world slows down and history gently whispers you to sleep. My name is Lillian, and I invite you to rest as we leave behind the noise of today and step softly into a time long forgotten. Tonight, we won't walk the halls of castles or follow kings into battle. We're going somewhere quieter, somewhere softer, a place where history breathes slowly in the hush between sunrise and supper. Imagine a narrow valley wrapped in mist, a handful of timber-framed cottages leaning into the wind, chickens pecking at the earth near a muddy road, the scent of wood smoke in the air, and something warm baking far away. You can hear the church bell, faint but steady, marking time not by seconds, but by prayer. This is not the history of the powerful, but of the ordinary. And yet, nothing about their lives was truly simple. Over the next few hours, I'll walk with you through the rhythm of a single day in a medieval village. We'll wake with the laborers, stand quietly in the cool of the chapel, and fall asleep beside the hearth, where stories linger in the glow of fading embers. We begin not with kings or wars or saints, but with a woman pulling open the shutters, with the rustle of straw underfoot and the first breath of morning. But before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of soft, hidden history. It helps keep this space calm, thoughtful, and warm. And if you'd like, I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. Leave a note in the comments. It's always a comfort to see how far these quiet stories reach. Now, let the world fade. Let the present slip gently out of focus, and follow me back in time to where the stories are slower and sleep waits patiently by the fire. Let's begin.
The first light is blue and cold. You don't wake up. Not exactly. You stir slowly, because the straw mattress beneath you itches, and your back is sore from yesterday's work in the fields. The hearth fire has long gone out, and there's no glass on the windows, only shutters, rattling gently as the wind slips through. You hear the cock crow, again and again. This is your alarm. You rise not when you're rested, but when you're needed. Your name might never be written in a book, but your life, your breath, your calloused hands, they are part of the bones of this village. Your tunic is scratchy, coarse wool, thick and roughly dyed. If you're lucky, it's been mended neatly. If you're very lucky, it's mostly dry. Underneath, perhaps linen, coarser still. You rinse your face with water drawn from the bucket near the door. It's cold enough to jolt your teeth. No soap, not yet. That's a luxury, and maybe reserved for holy days. And then you start your day. The village is not much by modern eyes, just a handful of homes, timber and wattle and daub, thatched roofs, smoke curling into the sky. There's no straight street, only a winding path, rutted with use. Animals walk freely. Chickens dart across the mud. A pig snorts near your door. Not a wild one, but your neighbor's, most likely. There might be 50 people here, or 200. Historians still argue whether medieval villages were mostly tiny hamlets or clustered communities. In truth, it varies. But they all shared the same slow rhythm, the same ringing bells. Church is not a place you go once a week. It's a presence, a schedule, a sound that orders your hours. The first bell rings at dawn, matins, then again at prime, and so on, through sext, nuns, vespers, compline. You may not be able to read Latin, but you know what those bells mean. Time to gather, time to kneel, time to work. And when you're not in church, you are in the field. You carry your tools, a hoe, a scythe, maybe a simple wooden rake. Iron is expensive. Wood splinters. You walk out toward the strip of land assigned to your family. It's narrow, long, just a portion of the open field system where every villager shares in the work and the harvest. The soil is uneven, sometimes rich with last year's compost, sometimes stubborn and cracked. Your back bends, your hands blister. The work begins before the sun fully rises and ends only when the shadows grow too long to see clearly. Mainstream accounts tell us peasants worked from sunrise to sunset all year round, but recent studies suggest that in between sowing and harvest, there were pauses, slow days, days to mend, to prepare, to breathe. Still, it wasn't easy. You eat bread, mostly, and pottage, a thick stew of grains and root vegetables. Sometimes, if fortune smiles, a bit of salted pork, rarely fresh, almost never plenty. One fringe fact: many peasants drank beer throughout the day, not to get drunk, but because it was safer than water. Small beer, they called it, low in alcohol, high in calories. Even children drank it. Clothes are made, not bought, spun from sheep's wool, dyed in batches, passed down again and again. If you're a woman, you may wear a linen shift, a long gown, an apron, and something to cover your head, always. If you're a man, it's a tunic, breeches, and hose. Shoes? Maybe, if they've been mended, or if the weather demands it. But many walk barefoot, especially in summer. In winter, cold creeps in, into the walls, into the floor, into your bones. The hearth is the only heat source, and even none, you huddle close to it, wrapped in whatever furs or rags can be found. You can tell the richest person in the village not by their home, but by their hat. Bright dye? Must be someone important, or someone pretending. As the sun dips low, smoke rises from each chimney. You return home, your muscles aching, but your stomach ready. The hearth is the center of your world, for warmth, for food, for stories. Pottage simmers, bread is torn, not sliced. You sit on stools or benches, or just the packed dirt floor. Someone hums an old tune. Someone complains about the reeve. Someone remembers when the weather was kinder. You may fall asleep early, or sit just a little longer watching the flames. Life is hard, yes, but not without moments of stillness. You may have not known the name of your village, or what kingdom you lived in, or what year it was, but you knew the seasons, the taste of fresh onions, the feel of your child's fingers grasping your own, the sound of the church bell calling across the fields. This was your world. And now let us gently turn from this daily rhythm and begin to look at the people who held the strings behind it, the ones who ruled, recorded, and sometimes reshaped this quiet life.
The village may appear small and self-contained, a patchwork of timber homes and muddy paths, but within it lies a carefully spun web of influence, a quiet hierarchy that shapes every breath, every hour, every harvest. You live in this world not alone, but in orbit around power. The highest of these powers is the Lord, a man you may never meet, yet who owns everything you touch. The field where your child first walked? His. The woods where you gather kindling? His. The stream that quenches your thirst? His too. And yet, his presence is spectral. He may live in a stone manor just over the hill, or in a castle 2 days' ride away. His banner may flutter in the wind, or perhaps you only know his name from whispered warnings and the Reeves list. His world is made of different materials: carved oak chairs, stained glass windows, strong ale, falconry. He holds court, not conversation. He rides, he judges, he taxes. And if war is called, he marches, leaving others to collect what he is owed. Enter the Reeve. He walks among you, not above but slightly apart, a peasant, like you, chosen from your own number, maybe even once your friend. But the Reeve's days are different now. He doesn't carry a scythe anymore. He carries a tally stick, a ledger, a quill. He knows who owes what, who skipped their labor days, who borrowed seed grain last winter. He reports directly to the steward of the manor, and by extension, the lord. The Reeve inspects the fields. He assigns turns at the mill. He ensures the boundaries are kept and the dues collected. He stands at the center of village judgment, a narrow bridge between justice and obligation. And yet even the Reeve bows his head in the presence of the priest. Church. Always the church. Not a grand cathedral, not here, just a stone chapel, or even wood and thatch. But within it lies eternity. The priest wears no crown, holds no sword, and yet his power is profound. He is keeper of the sacraments, of forgiveness, of the afterlife. He knows the Latin of the Mass, the script of the Gospels. He speaks with authority not only on sin, but on weather, famine, stars. He blesses your child. He buries your mother. He hears what you confess and what you don't. He may be kind, offering alms to the hungry, tending the sick, or he may be sharp, indulgent, cynical, using the word to tighten his grip. Either way, you do not challenge him, not openly. The tithe is taken, a tenth of all you have, even if you already have little. Given in grain, in chickens, in eggs, offered not just in faith, but in fear. Behind the altar, he keeps a book, one you cannot read, but it remembers who gave and who did not. And while the priest speaks for God, there are others who speak for the land. The miller, who handles every grain before it becomes bread. The blacksmith, whose tools make planting and harvesting possible. The midwife, who brings forth life in the darkest nights. And the herbalist, perhaps an old woman, her fingers stained with nettle and mint. She knows which roots cool fever and which leaves calm the womb. You trust her, or fear her, or both. These people have no official power, but power in the village isn't always official. It lives in the stories told around the fire, in the glance exchanged during church, in the way a name is said or not said. If a lord is feared, the reeve is resented, and the priest respected, the villagers watch one another. Did Thomas pay his debts? Did Agnes meet with the reeve after dark? Was that meat truly hunted or stolen? Gossip runs faster than any horse, and justice, village justice, is slow but sure. Not through courts, but through exclusion, through cold silences, through doors that remain closed. Yet, in this quiet hierarchy, everyone plays a part. The weaver's loom sings late into the night. The cooper binds barrels for ale. The children chase geese through the common. And as the bells toll once more, vespers now, you bow your head not just in prayer, but in acknowledgement that this is not just your life. It is a life within a structure older than memory, woven tight with fealty, faith, and fear. You don't rule, but you endure. And in enduring, you shape the village just as much as any lord. Now, let us step beyond this hierarchy, not toward the known, but toward the whispered, toward the forgotten, the strange, the hidden, toward the mysteries that once shaped this world and may still linger beneath its soil.
Now let's step softly away from the daylight of duties and the shadows of power and enter a realm just slightly out of focus. It is evening again in the village. Smoke curls gently from the thatched rooftops. The hearth is warm, supper is simple, and your body is worn from labor. Yet outside your door, there are whispers older than the church, older than the Lord's claim, older even than the language you speak. Imagine this. A traveler passes through your village, his cloak heavy with dust, his accent strange. He tells of standing stones that hum before storms, of valleys where no birds sing, of villages that vanished without a trace. You don't ask questions, you just listen. And when he leaves, you mark his words in silence. Because in your world, some knowledge lives in silence. You see, not all beliefs make it into the priest's sermons or the reeve's records. Some are passed from grandmother to granddaughter, whispered beneath moonlight, buried under years of repetition. In your village, one such belief lingers, that the woods beyond the fields are not quite empty, that a certain knotted oak should never be touched, that if the first snow falls on a Thursday, something must be burned before nightfall. Superstition? Perhaps. But in the Middle Ages, superstition and survival often walked hand in hand. There were charms made from bones, amulets sewn into children's tunics, bread marked with ash before baking, herbs placed on doorposts, not just for scent, but for warding, a clove of garlic tucked beneath the cradle, not for flavor, but for protection. And dreams, oh, the weight of dreams. A dream of falling teeth might mean betrayal. A dream of wolves, bad luck. A dream of clear water, a good harvest. Did everyone believe these things? Not always, but everyone knew them, just as they knew the church bells, the toll of the reeve's voice, the rhythm of the seasons. Some villagers took it further. In every hamlet there was one, usually a woman, often older, who knew more. She might be called a healer, a wise woman, a spinner of charms, or more dangerously, a witch. Historians still argue whether these so-called witches truly practiced magic or if they were simply the keepers of folk wisdom, scapegoats for misfortune, women who lived just outside the expected. But in your village, she might live in the edge house, where the forest meets the fen. She knows which mushroom kills and which mushroom heals. She knows how to set a broken leg, how to ease a troubled birth, how to speak to bees. And so, despite whispered fears, people come to her, quietly. She accepts eggs or cloth or secrets in exchange. She offers more than cures. She offers explanations in a world where explanation is scarce. Archaeologists today uncover odd things in medieval ruins: rows of bent pins beneath doorsteps, shoes hidden in walls, chicken bones arranged just so, and no one is quite sure why. Were these protections, offerings, accidents? The answer is lost, like so much of village belief, preserved not in parchment, but in habit. There's the curious matter of the bell ringing at storms to chase away evil air, or the practice of burying a hair braid under the first stone of a new home, or the quiet way villagers never say a certain name after sunset. Some called them pagan leftovers, fragments from before Christianity softened the edges of fear. Others called them old wives' tales. But for the people who lived by them, they were something more. They were tools, fragile ones, to give order to a life that was anything but orderly. Even the church, for all its structure and sermons, absorbed many of these practices. Holy wells were once sacred springs. Saints' feast days aligned nicely with older festivals. Crosses were carved on stones that long had stood in place. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is how early Christianity didn't replace belief, it wove itself around it, gently rebranding gods as saints and rituals as sacraments. And still, in private, villagers whispered old prayers, words passed down with no known origin. Maybe they didn't even know what they meant anymore, but the sound mattered, the act mattered. There's a story, whether true or not, we'll never know, of a village that burned a circle of rosemary in the center of their square every full moon. When asked why, no one could explain. They just always had. And so much of belief is exactly that. Not something understood, just something known. Here's a curious tidbit for you. In some regions of medieval Europe, it was believed that cats stole your soul while you slept. Not out of malice, but because they were drawn to warmth and breath. To prevent this, people slept with a small iron key under their pillow. Imagine that, drifting to sleep beside your hearth, soot on your fingers, the wind rattling your shutters, and a cold metal key beneath your cheek, just in case a purring visitor wandered too close. These stories make us smile now, but in a world without science, without weather forecasts, without medical charts, belief filled the gaps.
Historians still debate the role of these beliefs, whether they were harmful superstitions or vital psychological support systems. Perhaps they were both. They were part of the rhythm of life, just as threshing followed planting, just as silence followed sunset. And now, as the fire dies low in the imagined hearth of our medieval village, let us leave behind the flickers of unseen spirits, the charms and the chants, and turn our gaze toward more polished lives, not more peaceful, but certainly more gilded. It's time to move from the shadows of folklore into the salons of nobility, where power wore perfume and politics danced in slippers. Let's begin segment 4, a look at the lives of those who ruled, feasted, and fumbled, all from their gilded cages.
Now that we've wandered through the whispers of old beliefs, let's quietly open the great wooden doors of the manor house. Step softly. The air is cooler here, scented faintly of beeswax polish and dried lavender. Your shoes, or perhaps your bare feet, would fall silent on thick woven rushes or floorboards worn smooth by generations. Welcome to the world of the manor lord and lady. But don't mistake the opulence for ease. Imagine yourself not as a peasant this time, but as a young noble, perhaps the second son of a minor baron or the daughter of a landed knight. From your earliest memory, your world is cloaked in ritual. Meals are served at fixed hours. You are told when to speak and when to be silent. Your bed linens are changed not by your mother, but by someone who bows. Your education begins with etiquette. You learn which fork to use, but also how to sit for hours without complaint. You learn which prayers to recite, which colors are appropriate to wear in mourning, and how to make polite conversation with someone you deeply distrust. But behind the embroidered curtains and carved oak panels, life is not as luxurious as it seems. A mainstream historical fact many overlook is that noble houses were drafty, damp, and often smelled of smoke, mold, or old herbs. Yes, there were tapestries, but they weren't just decorative, they were insulation. Yes, there were feather beds, but they attracted lice just as easily as straw. Yes, there was meat, lots of meat, but preservation was difficult, and the taste often masked with spices and vinegar. And for women especially, the noble life was a performance, staged from dawn till dusk. Every garment worn was a statement. Silk said power, velvet said wealth. But even these fabrics were heavy, binding, and designed for posture over comfort. A noble woman might wear 3 or 4 layers, each fastened by intricate lacing or pins. A trip to the garde-robe was a production in itself. Imagine holding your breath as your lady's maid tightens your stays, or balancing a headdress wider than your shoulders. Imagine keeping your hands perfectly still at a feast, while your nose itches from the incense or the roast swan scent. Men, too, had their burdens. A young lord was expected to hunt, to joust, to debate theology, and to command. But leadership came with surveillance. Every word you uttered at court might be noted, every gesture interpreted, every gift analyzed for political intent.
Historians still debate whether the rituals of the noble life served to reinforce class structure or simply distracted the elite from their vulnerability. Perhaps both. Now let's glance at something more peculiar, a quirky tidbit tucked within this golden world. In some noble courts, the order of salt on the table reflected your rank. Sit above the salt, and you were someone. Sit below it, and you might as well have been invisible. This literal pecking order extended to every part of noble life. Marriages weren't romantic, they were contracts. Travel wasn't leisure, it was a display. Even mourning had rules. Wear black, yes, but not for too long, lest it seem performative, or not long enough, lest it seem callous. And the children? They were groomed early to take on these roles. A 6-year-old might be sent away to another noble house to serve as a page, beginning years of instruction not just in arms or letters, but in watching, always watching how the power moved. The elite life was not loud, it was carefully choreographed. A single misstep, an ill-timed laugh, a misplaced gift could ripple through court like wildfire. And yet there was joy. In music played softly on lute or harp, in the flicker of candlelight on polished pewter, in gardens where lavender and thyme grew in neat rows, in the letters sent by hawk or horse, sealed with warm wax and a sigh. But even these joys were performative. A nobleman reading poetry by the fire still worried about alliances. A noble woman wheezing by the window still calculated the day her daughter would be married off. Imagine living each day under the quiet weight of your own name, a name that is a shield and a chain, a name you must uphold. There's an old tale, whether true or not, we cannot say, of a noble woman who once fainted during Mass, not from piety or illness, but because her corset had been tied so tightly she could no longer breathe. And yet she rose again, bowed her head, and resumed the service. That was nobility. It wasn't just wealth, it was endurance. So as the candlelight softens and the velvet drapes flutter gently in a breeze that smells of distant meadows, we leave behind this world of careful luxury. Let us step now into something older than gold and deeper than ritual. There is something still beneath the soil, something older than kingdoms, older even than the first written laws. It hums beneath the moss, under the ruins, just beyond the veil of stone and ash. Now imagine night falling not with electric flicker, but with silence. No hum of appliances, no glow from a screen, just the soft crackle of a hearth and the rustle of leaves outside your thatched walls. In this world, belief is not a matter of doctrine. It is woven into the rhythms of your day. You do not ask whether the forest spirits are real. You simply leave a bowl of milk at the threshold, just in case. Let us journey now into the mystical, the half-remembered, the deeply rooted spiritual lives of the medieval peasantry. While formal religion in medieval Europe was dominated by the church, grand cathedrals, Latin prayers, relics enshrined in gold,
The everyday peasant lived a more hybrid spiritual life. They went to Mass, yes. They feared hell and hoped for heaven, but they also whispered to trees. They also buried iron nails beneath their doors to ward off misfortune. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval communities, even centuries after Christianization, maintained pre-Christian customs, in secret or by blending them into new rituals. The Church knew this, and it tolerated some of it, condemning others. In many regions, the old gods became saints. The sacred springs remained, just with new names. One quirky and lesser-known tidbit, in parts of rural Germany and the British Isles, it was customary to walk around a field 3 times clockwise at planting season while chanting a protective rhyme. This was not just a blessing, but a negotiation with the land itself. The field was alive, the wind a voice, the stone a memory. Peasant spirituality was a living system of signs and gestures. A crow calling at dusk could foretell a death. A dream about running water meant someone would marry. A cracked egg might reveal a witch. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were truly ancient remnants of pagan systems or spontaneous responses to a harsh and unpredictable life. But what is certain is that these beliefs offered comfort, structure, a sense of meaning. And the sacred spaces? They were not always within stone chapels. Sometimes they were groves, rings of trees where the light fell differently. Sometimes it was a boulder that had never been moved, even as fields were plowed around it. Sometimes it was a crossroads where 3 paths met and where you'd never whistle after dark. There were herbs for dreams, rituals for childbirth, charms sewn into the hem of a dying child's gown. A woman in the village, perhaps older, with a crooked smile, might be the one who knew which plant to brew for fever and which word to whisper for safe passage through illness. She might be feared, but more often she was respected. Not a witch, a wise one. The Church would not always agree. There were inquisitions. There were sermons about devils hiding in dreams. But in small villages, on long winter nights, the old stories survived. Imagine you are lying on a rough straw mattress. Your body aches from the day's toil, but your mother or your grandmother or your neighbor leans close and tells you, softly, of a spirit who guards the brook, of a child taken by the fair folk, only to return changed, of a white stag seen at the edge of the forest, a sign of coming fortune. And in the quiet, as the wind rattles the shutters, your mind drifts. You don't know whether the stories are true, but you hope they are, because the world feels kinder when you believe it's listening. Let us pause here, with a bowl of milk by the door, with the candle gently flickering low, with the memory of prayers older than ink. And in that pause, we'll prepare to step back into the living world, into the bustling heart of medieval trade and travel, the wagons, the fairs,
The toll bridges, the songs. In the quiet corners of medieval life, amid all the toil and hardship, there existed another kind of rhythm, one dictated not by hunger or harvest, but by ritual. The bells that tolled in the distance were more than just a measure of time. They marked spiritual boundaries, sanctified moments, and reminded people of their place in the grand scheme of heaven and earth. In this segment, let's settle into the soft hum of sacred practices that wove themselves into the daily fabric of medieval village life. Picture yourself in a small stone chapel where the scent of beeswax candles mingles with the faint aroma of damp moss. Wooden pews are worn smooth from generations of worshippers. The priest, robed in linen dyed with plant-based hues, chants softly in Latin, a language few villagers understand, yet one that envelops them in a cocoon of the divine. Ritual wasn't just a Sunday affair. It was a cycle that embraced birth, marriage, illness, and death. From baptisms to burial, every major life event was nestled in ceremony. But even beyond these milestones, there were feast days, fast days, saints' days, each one dictating what could be eaten, worn, or done. There were more than 150 holy days in some years, giving life a punctuated, almost musical rhythm. Imagine waking before dawn to hear the Angelus bell, signaling prayer. In between fieldwork or spinning wool, villagers would pause for devotions, often murmured silently, occasionally sung aloud. These weren't grand moments, they were humble, almost whispered, the soft, steady breath of belief that gave comfort in uncertainty. Some rituals straddled the line between the sacred and the strange. Take the beating of the bounds, for example, a springtime tradition where villagers would walk the edges of their parish and beat children with branches at the corners, not out of cruelty, but to ensure the boundaries would be remembered. Historians still debate whether this was truly religious or a vestige of pagan land magic, cloaked in Christian practice. Fringe customs were everywhere. Holy wells were visited with whispered wishes. Tiny charms were sewn into garments to protect against demons. Bread was marked with crosses before baking. Not just superstition, but sacred safeguarding. Even animals were sometimes blessed. And yet, ritual had its share of tensions. There were clashes between church expectations and folk beliefs. Some villagers clung to older, earthier customs, quietly, secretly. Did the church know? Likely. Did it always intervene? Not necessarily. Historians still argue whether medieval Christianity fully replaced older spiritual systems or simply absorbed them under new names. A particularly fascinating ritual centered around relics, tiny fragments of saints' bones or cloth housed in ornate reliquaries. These objects weren't just admired, they were believed to channel divine power. Pilgrims would travel great distances to touch them, pray before them, or simply bask in their presence. Some churches even claimed that their relics had cured blindness, healed festering wounds, or reversed infertility. Was it divine? Psychological? Coincidence? Historians still debate. The pilgrimage itself was ritual incarnate. Pilgrims, often poor, barefoot, and burdened with penance, would walk hundreds of miles to shrines like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela. The journey was an act of faith, a slow unraveling of sin through blistered feet and quiet prayer.
Along the way, there were pilgrim inns, way stations, chapels, and the occasional souvenir stand. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, you could buy a trinket to prove you'd been somewhere sacred. Perhaps a tin badge shaped like a scallop shell, or a small cross, or even a vial said to contain holy water. But rituals weren't always solemn. There were festivals where religious meaning blended with revelry. The Feast of Fools, for instance, turned the church on its head. Literally, choir boys might dress as bishops. Mock sermons were given. It was chaotic, noisy, and oddly approved, within limits. A pressure valve for society, perhaps. A time to laugh at the sacred so one could later return to it with seriousness. And then there were processions. On feast days, villagers would walk through fields and roads in organized lines, singing hymns and carrying icons. Imagine the sound of wooden clogs on packed earth, the low drone of Latin chant, and the sunlight glinting off gold-embroidered vestments. These processions weren't just displays of faith, they were acts of communal solidarity, reminders that salvation was a shared endeavor. Ritual bled into daily objects too. Water drawn from a holy well might be used to bless a field. Ashes from last year's Palm Sunday were placed on foreheads at the start of Lent. Herbs were gathered not just for flavor, but for their symbolic protection. A sprig of rue behind the ear, a garland of St. John's wort above the door, these were both botanical and mystical acts. Even childbirth, the most vulnerable moment in a medieval woman's life, was surrounded by layers of ritual. Prayers were recited before labor. The birthing room might be darkened and adorned with holy images. If the child was weak or not expected to survive, a midwife might perform an emergency baptism, a quiet rite in a basin of warm water, whispered in haste and trembling hope. We could drift further still into funeral rites. A death in the village was followed by a long sequence of prayers, vigils, and processions. Candles were lit, bells were rung. The body, often laid out in the home, was visited by neighbors who prayed or simply sat in respectful silence. The burial itself was a final ritual, simple yet profound. Earth upon earth, life returned to the soil. But not everyone rested so peacefully. Beliefs in ghosts, often called revenants, crept into the darker corners of ritual life. If someone had died unshriven or unrepentant, stories claimed they might walk the earth. In some areas, rituals developed to lay these spirits by placing blessed objects in the grave or praying at specific times. Was it myth or an expression of communal grief? Again, historians continued to wonder. So much of medieval ritual was about control, of the unknown, the divine, the chaotic. In a world where famine or plague could strike at any moment, these symbolic acts gave people a sense of purpose. They could not stop the storm, but they could light a candle. They could not guarantee a good harvest, but they could bless the soil. They could not avoid death, but they could sanctify it. In the end, ritual in the medieval village was not mere tradition. It was lifeblood, invisible, steady, deeply human. It helped define who belonged, who was blessed, who was remembered. And while many of these rituals seem distant to us now, their quiet comfort still echoes in modern gestures: the lighting of a candle, the bow of a head, the ring of a bell.
As we gently continue our journey through the layers of medieval life, we arrive at a subject both intimate and mysterious: how people understood and tried to mend the body. In a world without modern hospitals, antibiotics, or even a full understanding of germs, the act of healing was a delicate dance between faith, folklore, and fragile hope. Let yourself imagine now, lying beneath a woolen blanket on a straw mattress, your body aching from fever, your skin warm to the touch. The small room is dimly lit by a tallow candle, and in its glow, a village healer leans over you. She's older, her fingers weathered by years of picking herbs, her eyes sharp despite the fog of age. She whispers softly, her voice a blend of prayer and knowledge passed down through generations. In medieval villages, medicine was rarely the domain of professionals. There were no physicians in most rural areas, at least not in the way we imagine today. Instead, healing came from a patchwork of sources: wise women, monks, herbalists, midwives, and barbers who also happened to cut into flesh when needed. It was a community effort, often imprecise, sometimes inspired, and always guided by layers of tradition. Much of medieval medical thought was built on ancient theories, particularly the concept of the four humors. According to this belief, your body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each one corresponded to elements, seasons, and even personality types. Illness, it was thought, came from an imbalance in these humors, and so healing meant restoring harmony, sometimes through gentle methods, and sometimes through less pleasant ones. Imagine being treated for a fever. You might be bled, not because anyone wished you harm, but because drawing out blood was believed to cool the body. A small cut on the arm or the application of leeches was common. The tools were sterilized, if at all, with wine or vinegar. The process was as much symbolic as physical, a way to draw out imbalance, to let the sickness seep away. Herbal remedies, however, offered a gentler touch. Villagers believed deeply in the power of plants: yarrow for wounds, fennel for digestion, chamomile for calming the nerves. Garlic was prized for its ability to ward off illness, not just by boosting health, but by driving away evil spirits. And if the healer was especially skilled, she might chant softly while brewing her potions, binding the physical with the spiritual. Monasteries, too, were hubs of healing. Within their cloistered gardens, monks cultivated dozens of medicinal herbs. Their infirmaries provided some of the earliest forms of organized care, with beds, clean linens, and warm broth served to the sick. Manuscripts copied by hand detailed treatments, dosages, and warnings. Though limited in scope, these monastic hospitals were places of relative comfort in a harsh world. But not all ailments could be soothed with herbs. When pain turned inward, into the mind or the soul, healing took a different form. Mental illness, though poorly understood, was real. Those afflicted might be cared for with prayers, songs, and isolation. Sometimes they were feared, sometimes revered. In certain villages, a person touched by visions might be seen as a vessel for divine messages. And then there were the surgeons. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, surgery existed. Barber surgeons performed amputations, lanced abscesses, and stitched wounds. Without anesthesia, pain was intense, but speed was a surgeon's greatest skill. A clean cut,
A tight bandage and perhaps a whispered prayer were the best a patient could hope for. The instruments were simple: knives, saws, needles, boiled, if possible, wiped, if not. The line between butchery and healing was thin. Some procedures were more peculiar. Trepanation, the drilling of a small hole into the skull, was occasionally used to release bad spirits or to relieve pressure after injury. Skulls have been found bearing these holes with signs of healing. That means the patient survived, for a time at least. Historians still debate how widespread and how effective these surgeries were. And as always, faith stood at the center. Many illnesses were seen as divine punishments or tests. Healing meant more than mending flesh. It required confession, repentance, and sometimes a pilgrimage to a holy site. Relics of saints were touched in hope of a cure. Holy water was sprinkled. Miracles were whispered about, passed from hearth to hearth. Fringe practices abounded. Astrological medicine was popular. Your treatment might depend on the position of Mars or the phase of the moon. Charms were worn not just for comfort, but to redirect harmful forces. Some patients were buried up to their necks in warm compost or mud, believing the earth itself could draw out pain. One peculiar tidbit: in some regions, a common prescription for toothache involved boiling a frog in wine, then using the liquid as a mouth rinse. Did it work? Perhaps only in the sense that it distracted the patient from the pain. The contrast between theory and practice was stark. Learned physicians might speak Latin, quote Galen, and calculate star charts, but the villager relied on what she could see, smell, grow, and gather. Healing was as much intuition as instruction. Yet, in this imperfect system, bonds of care were quietly forged. Midwives didn't just assist in childbirth, they were counselors, confidants, and sometimes the only medical presence in a woman's life. They knew how to coax a reluctant infant into the world, how to calm a trembling mother, how to prepare poultices to ease afterpains. Their knowledge, though informal, was vast. Folk cures also bridged the space between superstition and survival. A garland of mugwort around the neck, a spoonful of honey mixed with crushed nettles, a charm stitched into a child's tunic. These weren't simply remedies, they were acts of love. Small rituals performed in the hope that they might hold back illness just a little longer. And through all this, the body remained a mystery. Inside the walls of universities in distant cities, the dissection of cadavers, when permitted, offered glimpses into the hidden workings of organs and muscles. But for the villagers, such knowledge was distant. The body was sacred and silent. Its ailments spoke in fevers and coughs, not in diagrams or Latin names. Historians still argue whether medieval medical traditions were dangerously misguided or quietly effective in ways we've underestimated. The written records favor scholars, but oral histories, the whispered wisdom of grandmothers, the memories of herbs gathered at twilight, speak of another kind of expertise. And so we leave this chapter with a quiet thought. Even when the cures failed, the care mattered. A hand held during a fever, a warm broth prepared with trembling fingers, a lullaby hummed at the edge of sleep. These small kindnesses did not heal the body, but perhaps they healed something else. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval village, medicine was not merely a science, it was a human gesture. And now, as we let the last trace of incense and herb smoke fade from the air, we drift onward to a place of stories, games, and the hidden joys of leisure.
As we approach the end of our journey, let's pause to listen. Not with our ears, but with our imagination. What did a medieval village truly sound like? The history books often give us silence or battle cries, but daily life, in all its subtle harmony, carried a music all its own. At dawn, the first sound was often the rooster, not a cliché, but a real herald of morning echoing across dewy fields. Then came the creak of wooden shutters, the whisper of feet on straw-strewn floors, and the gurgle of water drawn from wells. There was rhythm to everything, the steady beat of a scythe in hay, the splash of laundry slapped against a stone, children chattering, a dog barking, bells from the distant chapel calling the faithful, not loud, but ever present. The village was alive with soft, repetitive comfort. Music, too, was threaded into life. Though no orchestras graced these lanes, instruments were crafted from what was on hand: bones, reeds, string. Shepherds played the pipe, farmers whistled tunes. In the evening, someone might strum a lute or beat a drum made from stretched animal hide. Folk songs were passed from mouth to mouth, echoing across generations. Lyrics changed slightly from one valley to the next, shaped by accent and experience. Some songs told of lost loves, others were work chants, set to the cadence of hoe or hammer. A few were nonsense, whimsical sounds to chase away fatigue. In winter, inside low-ceilinged cottages, the voice became the instrument. Harmonies hummed while spinning wool, lullabies wove their way into children's dreams. There were no radios, no recordings. Music lived only as long as someone remembered the notes. Even nature played its part. The wind hissed through cracks in the timber, rain drummed on thatch, geese cried, crickets chirped, and sometimes, in rare moments of stillness, there was near silence, save for the breath of sleeping cattle or the crackle of the fire. Today, we fill our lives with noise, podcasts, alerts, engines, chatter. But for the medieval villager, sound was more selective, more sacred. Each tone mattered, each pause was profound. Historians agree that music served both spiritual and social purposes, but they still debate just how musical village life was. Some suggest singing was a constant companion. Others believe it was reserved for the few who had time and talent. A charming detail, though, one monastery record tells of a peasant boy whose whistling was so pure, monks invited him to join the choir, despite his muddy boots and lack of Latin. Imagine the soft hum of bees in the meadow outside, the murmur of voices at the bakehouse, the crackle of dry wood on a winter's night, the sharp clang of iron on the blacksmith's anvil. Every task came with its own soundscape, distinct, rhythmic, and often comforting. The village mill, powered by a creaking water wheel, was a hub of sound. The slow groan of wooden gears, the rasp of grain being ground, and the laughter of children trying to speak over it all. For many, this was music, the hum of survival. Even during prayer, sound guided the day. The bell tower didn't just call to mass, it marked time, celebrated marriages, tolled for the dead. Its chime was often the only clock most villagers ever knew.
In festivals, the entire soundscape changed. Drums rolled, voices rose in chorus, clappers, pipes, even makeshift horns made from animal horns or bark. Songs told of saints and harvests, of local heroes, of love gained and lost. Each season brought its own auditory palette. Spring meant frogs and running brooks. Summer buzzed with flies and laughter. Autumn whispered with the rustle of drying leaves. Winter crackled with firewood and muffled footsteps in snow. And in all of it, the silence mattered too. Moments of stillness when the village paused were revered. A shared hush at dusk, the lull after prayer, or the calm when all lights had dimmed. So let the imagined sounds of this world drift over you now. The rustle of cloth, the gentle trill of a bird settling for the night, the memory of a long-forgotten song, half sung under a starlit sky, and allow them to carry you deeper into quiet.
And now, step with me into the warmest corner of the village, the inn. Low beams, soot-streaked walls, and a fire that never quite goes out. This isn't a luxury tavern, not by any stretch, but it is the heartbeat of evening life in the medieval village. The inn was often little more than a wide common room, with benches, a long table, and a few wooden mugs that had seen better days. A single pot simmered over the hearth, always something warm, though its contents varied wildly depending on who had traded what that day. By dusk, villagers trickled in, a laborer with aching hands, a shepherd with a story, a tanner still smelling of leather. No reservations here, no menus. Just shared space and soft conversation. And drink, of course. Ale brewed in the back, cloudy and warm. Sometimes cider, if the harvest was kind. Mead on rare days. It wasn't about intoxication, not always, but about marking the end of toil with something communal. Stories flowed here more freely than drink. Some were true, others delightfully less so. Tales of ghostly lights in the woods, of a monk who sneezed so hard he cured a fever, of distant towns where bread grew on trees. The innkeeper was often a storyteller, judge, and therapist rolled into one. She or he heard every squabble, every rumor. A good innkeeper remembered who owed what, who fought whom, and which farmer's daughter had just gotten engaged. There were rules, of course. No knives drawn, no insults past a point. But otherwise, the inn was the only place where everyone, rich, poor, clean, dirty, sat together. Board games made of pebbles or carved wood pieces passed time. Songs were sung, not always in tune. Sometimes a traveler brought news from the outside world, and everyone leaned in. Other times, someone stood to recite a rhyme, and laughter would follow. It was loud, but not overwhelming. The kind of noise that wrapped around you like a worn blanket. The crackle of fire, the thud of mugs, the rise and fall of voices. And above all, warmth. Against the chill of stone cottages and unheated rooms, the inn offered the illusion of comfort, just for a while. A curious fact: some innkeepers were licensed by the lord of the manor, required to report anything suspicious said after ale flowed. Others turned a blind eye. Historians still debate how much power these humble hosts truly wielded. In one record, a traveling bard stayed in a village inn and paid for his bed not in coin, but in stories. He recited tales from 3 kingdoms over, and the innkeeper gave him a warm place to sleep and a bowl of stew. The medieval inn was also the space of subtle romance, a sideways glance, a shy gift of dried apples, a seat saved beside the hearth. It was where the lonely found company and the tired found, if not peace, at least distraction. No one slept here well. The floor was hard, the straw shared with strangers, but no one expected more. So, as the fire dims and voices fade into sleepy murmurs, imagine yourself there, wrapped in a wool cloak, fingers warm around a wooden mug. The day is done. Outside, stars blink into view. Inside, stories curl like smoke toward the rafters. And maybe, just maybe, you stay until the last ember fades.
And so, dear listener, we've walked together through narrow earthen lanes, past crumbling timber walls, and fields dotted with poppies. We've sat beside fire-warmed hearths, listened to bells toll in soft rhythm, and watched invisible days unfold in a world both foreign and deeply familiar. The medieval village was never silent. Even in its stillness, it spoke. In the clatter of spoons, the hum of bees, the groan of oxen on muddy roads. In those simple, often unseen lives, we find echoes of ourselves. They loved, toiled, laughed, hoped, much as we do. Only the tools were different, only the pace slower, only the nights darker. There was beauty in their rhythm. There was hardship, yes, but also a kind of peace that comes with predictability, a sun that always rose, bells that always rang, seasons that returned like old friends. You might have struggled in such a world. You might have missed warmth, privacy, or rest. But perhaps part of you would have found comfort too, in community, in repetition, in knowing your place beneath the stars. As the candles burn low and the fire fades into quiet coals, I invite you to let go gently of this village and of the world outside your window. Let the steady beat of their daily life become a lullaby. Let the soft rhythm of a spinning wheel or the hush of footsteps on packed earth carry you toward sleep. Because in this moment, you needn't till the fields or fetch the water. You are safe. You are warm. You are here. And tomorrow, history will still be waiting. If this quiet journey through the past brought you comfort tonight, feel free to return whenever the world feels too loud. You can always find your way back to the past here. And if you'd like to wander through more forgotten corners of history, you're gently invited to subscribe to this channel, so the next time you need rest, a story will be waiting. Sleep well, and good night.